Final Fantasy VII is one of the most famous games of all time. Even if you've never played it, you've certainly heard of it. It's been more than 20 years since the game was first released, and in that time, the video game industry has seen staggering innovation and massive growth. Still, Final Fantasy VII remains one of the most highly rated, most beloved, and most talked about games in history. Whenever there's a list of the best games ever made, Final Fantasy VII is sure to be on it. And if you ask people who their favorite video game character is, there's a decent chance they'll name someone from this game. Why? What was so special about Final Fantasy VII? That's what this video is going to answer. In 1996, Square were coming off of Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger, both of which had been tremendously well received by RPG fans. At the time, Square were firmly identified as a loyal Nintendo cohort, so when they announced that the highly anticipated sequel to Final Fantasy VI would be released for the Sony PlayStation instead of the Nintendo 64, it came as a shock to fans. For a lot of kids my age, Square's decision to support Sony single-handedly decided the war of the new generation of consoles. Certainly for me it did. I had been a Nintendo fanboy, but the risk of not getting to play the sequels to Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger seemed at the time to be a fate worse than death. At this time, Sony's PlayStation was struggling to gain ground against the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Saturn. With Final Fantasy VII becoming a PlayStation exclusive, Sony saw an opportunity to bring a killer app onto the market. Not only would Final Fantasy VII become the first game in the series to get a worldwide release, but it would be bolstered by a massive marketing effort. To promote the game outside of Japan, Square and Sony launched a $30 million ad campaign that featured television commercials, magazine articles, comic book ads, and more. Suddenly, it wasn't just RPG fans who were salivating over Final Fantasy VII. Now everyone was talking about it. Even people who'd never played video games before were eagerly waiting for the new Final Fantasy to come out. Every month, gaming magazines counted the days to the release. The internet had recently broken through to the mainstream, and word of the game spread like wildfire online.
Oh, it's hard to convey, it's a little hard to convey any other game that would elicit this kind of reaction, right? It's a little difficult to explain to people why so many people had the same fucking reaction. Like, why so many people have this insanely profound, tear-jerking moment that sort of just encapsulates an entire giant theater of people and everyone across the, why, how the fuck does this game do that? And I think FF7's kind of a special game for a lot of people, and I'm gonna say from a very personal level, I didn't play RPGs, right? I didn't really play a lot of video games with a lot of story before Final Fantasy VII. FF7 was the first game to do that for me. I wasn't into the whole, knights and D&D and all that stuff as a kid. I thought that was, nerdy bullshit. I just didn't like it. But for a lot of people, and including myself, it was the gateway to video games being a narrative. To you getting attached to characters instead of just playing a game for the sake of, playing a game. I like Guile, you know? Because he's Guile and he's cool. But now, you're attached to a character and what makes that character a character. What makes them appealing in some way, similar to the way people, got attached to Star Wars or something like that. So, the reason why FF7 does this to so many people is because for a lot of them, including myself, this was the first time, you lived a game with characters. This was the first time you experienced a journey with characters, and you didn't feel like you were just watching a movie. You didn't feel like you just were a part of something that was there and then it was over. You felt like you were there with them, you know? You felt like it was some shit was connected to you. And for anyone that was growing up or a teenager or younger around this time frame, the first game that's the gateway to these kind of games is a pretty big one.
a special video for me because I get to gush a little bit on my favorite game and favorite story of all time, which is Final Fantasy VII. I may come off a little bias in this, but my bias is based on factual information and stories of not only myself, but accounts of people around the world that I've gotten to know doing this, who message me, who text me, who, talk to me on streams and stuff, and how this video game has profoundly affected the lives of thousands of people around the world. I've never heard of a video game in my life that has had the impact on people's lives that this one has had. It has been there like a good friend through hard times, gives us a place to retreat to, gives us a familiar story of the hero's journey, of good versus evil, of good triumphing over evil, and also dealing with our own demons. And that's a lot of what Final Fantasy VII is about. Everyone has to deal with their demons and the things they're hiding to come to the truth of the matter of who they really are as opposed to who they want to be. And a lot of times who we want to be is not who we really are. And looking in the mirror, as far as that goes, and looking at that contrast, is a hard thing to do. And this game deals with that.
Even after all that hype, the game did not disappoint. At the time, Final Fantasy VII was the most expensive video game ever produced, and the team that worked on it was described as the largest development team of any game up to that point. The enormous budget allowed Square to take full advantage of the capabilities of the PlayStation hardware, and this translated into a dramatic leap forward in how the creators could realize their vision. Where Final Fantasy VI had been constrained to scenes that took place on entirely flat 2D landscapes, Final Fantasy VII used pre-rendered 3D backgrounds that employed depth, camera angles, and scaling of character models to present a huge variety of different environments. Fields and dungeons could be stretched out into vast open spaces to give a sense of scale and scope. Key scenes benefited from the ability to show environments from different angles and perspectives, essentially using camera work to add cinematic language and narrative power to the scene. The world map allowed for a fully three-dimensional representation of a globe, adding verticality to landscapes and geographical features that would rise up over the horizon as you drew near, mimicking the Earth's curvature. Once the heroes acquired the airship, the world map could be experienced in its full glory, giving a sense of freedom unlike anything else at the time. Battles played out cinematically, using a dynamic camera system to show the action from different angles depending on the actions taken by the player characters and enemies. The game was more like a movie than any console game before it. To add extra weight to the story's most dramatic moments, the game made use of full-motion video sequences, like this one of Sephiroth striding through the flames of burning Nibelheim, a scene so iconic it has seared itself into the brains of a whole generation of gamers. Final Fantasy VII's soundtrack is one of the most important video game scores of all time. Nobuo Uematsu had been scoring the Final Fantasy series since the very first game. His name was already hallowed to the fanbase, but Final Fantasy VII became the point where he really cemented his legacy as the most famous and beloved composer of video game music in the world. Uematsu saw the transition from Super Nintendo to PlayStation as an exciting opportunity to experiment with things that hadn't been possible to do in the earlier games. One of the things the developers wanted to do was to give the game a theme song with lyrics. This idea had to be scrapped and was eventually pulled off in Final Fantasy VIII. Instead, Uematsu composed One Winged Angel. This track, used in the final battle with Sephiroth, was the first in the series to include a vocal track, and made the game's climactic encounter an absolutely spectacular experience. There's a whole generation of gamers out there who still haven't been able to pick their jaws off the ground after first hearing those lyrics kick in. The team wanted a soundtrack that would give the game a more cinematic feel. A soundtrack where each scene would have its own piece of music, though some could be variations on the same tune with its tempo or intensity changed. Although Uematsu had to repeat some pieces of music at times, this overall ambition made the game's compositions more like a film score than a traditional video game soundtrack. The result was an unforgettable masterpiece, melancholic, foreboding, dramatic and energetic, as the situation demanded.
This game went out of its way to get people interested, to change things, to put it in a world that was different than the worlds that you had seen before, and make it as visually splendorous as it is. We played it. I mean, I even remember hearing about FF7. I'm like, that's dumb. I'm just going to play Virtua Fighter, whatever. And then I was at a friend's house and he was farming for chocobos. I didn't even play FF7 when it came out, right? I wasn't even a part of that. But I was at a friend's house sitting on a couch and he was just grinding for gold chocobos. He was just trying to get a gold chocobo in FF7. And he was going through some parts of the game and I could not forget the music. He's like, he actually told me, dude, the music in this game is incredible. And I'm like pretty young, right? I'm like very early teenage years. And it made me really realize, like, yeah, the music makes you feel shit in this game. The music has this very dark, very moody. It was just different than the video game music that I liked before, which was like Killer Instinct stuff, right? I had the Killer Instinct soundtrack, so I made like a connection that video game music is cool. But when FF7 rolled around, it was like the foreboding atmosphere of the whole game was just, especially because what was he doing? He was running around the world map looking for chocobos. He was running up and down tracks and shit. The world theme of FF7 was just like, wow, this is like hauntingly crazy.
Final Fantasy VII's soundtrack had a massive impact. It was the first game soundtrack to place in the Japanese music charts. It opened countless people's eyes to the beauty of orchestral music, and it was one of the driving forces behind the push that finally shoved video game music over that cusp, from having been seen as silly tunes for kids to being celebrated for what it is today. The most diverse, imaginative, freaking amazing genre of music there is. Nostalgia is a powerful thing. It can make you see things others can't. Is the game as good as it was back in '97? No. 23 years ago, Final Fantasy VII was arguably the greatest story-based game ever made. Time has marched on, and video games have seen a great deal of progress in the intervening years. Just like Final Fantasy VII altered our expectations of what was possible, other games have done the same since. You just can't go back and get the same experience I had on Christmas morning of 1997. But that doesn't make the game any less significant than it once was. Final Fantasy VII wasn't the beginning and it wasn't the end, but the game was amazing. As a work of art, it belongs on the wall of the Louvre, right next to the Mona Lisa. Now that I've seen what's possible, I can't go back. A bad remake can't ruin the original game, but a good one can. I never asked for a remake, but now that it's here, I feel grateful. The remake is a gift, and I'm so happy that a new generation of teenagers will get a chance to fall in love with these characters and this story, just like I did 23 years ago.
Almost there, Cloud. We're almost there.
I miss it. The steel sky.
I would be lost, drifting alone, floating up high. Time